Hello YouTube, Dave here again. A few years ago I released a series of videos that was a retrospective of the different editions of Dungeons & Dragons. It was a series that I put a lot of time and energy into, especially at a point in time which I didn't have a lot of time or energy. And I'm really proud of the way that the series came out overall, and there's not much that I would really change about it, with really one sort of exception. And that's what I want to discuss here today, and that exception is how I presented the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It was the first version of D&D that I ever played, so it was the first version in that series that I was able to sort of integrate some personal experiences and thoughts and feelings into, but I don't think that I did an adequate job of separating the personal experiences or opinions from the actual historical facts, like the decline of TSR. So I want to take a little bit of time here today to sort of correct or right some of those wrongs and just sort of share some of my experiences with 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. One of the big things is that I didn't have a lot of great experiences with 2nd edition AD&D, and I think that that sort of soured me on it for quite a while. At the time that I recorded those videos, the only 2nd edition products that I really had were the core books, I think a couple of adventures, and 1 or 2 campaign setting sort of box set things, like the Red Steel, there was a Dragonlance one, and I had a couple of Ravenloft sets. But it was really the edition of D&D that I was the least interested in. And I don't think that that's really necessarily fair, and it was my early experiences, I think, with it that really sort of shaped how that turned out. So the first thing, like I said, it was where I started playing D&D, it was where I first discovered the game, but it was, when I say it was a complicated version of Dungeons & Dragons, it's how it was for me trying to learn it at the time. And that was one of the things that really sort of shaped my negative thoughts on 2nd edition, was just that nobody wanted to teach me how to play it at any point throughout the entire time that I was playing as a player. Nobody would actually take the 2 minutes to explain some things. So was THAC0 really that complicated a system? Not when you actually know how to do it, but nobody would tell you how to do it. Nobody would teach me, and I was probably still about 4 or 5 months of playing before I finally was able to find and buy a player's handbook. And things kind of opened up from there, but it was one of those things where just having nobody wanting to teach me early on how to play the game and what the rules were, and would just get frustrated when they asked what armor class I hit, and I said I don't know because I didn't know how the system worked. So it was one of those things that I think really kind of shaped my perception of it for quite some time, because it was just one of those things that when you're new at something and everyone that you're playing with is much more experienced and knows the system at least passingly, it gets really frustrating, because again, that was what I encountered a lot of, was the dungeon master being frustrated or irritable with me because I didn't know how to figure out the attack roll system, and that was because nobody would teach me. So that was one, again, really sort of negative experience. Another thing that I'd said in the video was that the system was complicated due to the amount of optional rules that were in it. And I've had some people defend that, and for the most part, you're probably right. The optional rules can really enhance someone's individual campaign, and I totally understand that. It's just not the experience that I had with it. So at one point, I was playing in 3 separate 2nd edition AD&D campaigns, one of which was really consistent, and the other 2 were... so the first one was super consistent on a near weekly basis. The second one was almost on a weekly basis, and the third one was probably the spottiest of the 2, where I think we only played about 3 or 4 sessions, and it was spread out over kind of a wide area. The issue was that every single one of those dungeon masters had different rule sets that they had used, and there was really very little internal consistency. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, one group was individual initiative with weapon speed factors and casting times. The character generation was 3d6, drop the lowest assigned to taste, and There were, I think, it used the at death's door rule where you die at -10. It used the non-weapon proficiencies and weapon proficiency slots. Well, again, well, the non-weapon proficiencies was definitely sort of an optional system. There's a lot of things sort of along those lines. The second group used a lot of those same rules, but there was enough of a difference that you would kind of forget sometimes. For example, in that group, it was 4d6 dropped the lowest, but I believe it was in order that you assign the stats. Death occurred at when you dropped to 0 hit points. Instead of going into the negatives, you were making saving throws versus like death magic or death attacks, and that you had to make one of those each round, and you could make those until you either failed or were stabilized. So that was another one of those rules that became a little bit sort of cumbersome. Like there was one encounter where I actually thought that I was dead because the damage that I took dropped me below -10, and I was about ready to get rid of the character sheet when, there's like, no, we use the thing that I want to use is the death. It's like a saving throw versus death. So I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. And then the third group was 3d6 down the line, no non-weapon proficiencies. It was group initiative with casting times and weapon speed factors being used only for tiebreakers. Death occurred at 0 hit points, and it was a lot to sort of keep track of. And now I, again, let those sort of frustrations and there were more and more examples. I just can't think of them off the top of my head, but there was a very large lack of consistency between what optional rules were and were not being used. And it was just one of those things that I was playing enough games that they were starting to sort of muddy together. And you would honestly just sort of make some mistakes. And for there was one group where it was like 3d6 down the line. It was a very, very old school sort of mentality. And when I ever referenced something that was an optional rule that we weren't using, the Dungeon Master got a little bit frustrated with that. And there was just so much of that, happening, and so many of these adventures or campaigns going on all at the same time, that it was very difficult to keep everything straight from one group to the next. And again, that was sort of my personal experience, and I let that, again, sort of inform my opinion of the rule set overall. And I honestly don't think that that's something that a lot of people would have been experiencing, because I don't know how many people would have been playing in 3 separate games at once with DMs who had very, very different philosophies on the rule set. In sort of the later years, when I was running like a 2nd edition game and playing in a 2nd edition game, we had all sort of kind of arrived at the same conclusion as to what rules worked best for the same group, because it was all the same group of players for the most part, playing in these different groups. So anyway, it was just one of those things that, again, I think I let those frustrations and, again, the reactions of the Dungeon Master, who would get frustrated if I mentioned something like making a non-weapon proficiency check, or certain things along those lines, or looking to make my saving throw versus death if I got to 0 hit points, or hoping to be stabilized because I was in the negative hit points. So it was just one of those things that, again, it was probably not something that a lot of people would have been running into, but it was the experience that I had. And again, I presented it, I think, more as just a blanket statement that the amount of optional rules could be overwhelming or confusing. And I think that was based solely on how it happened for me and not for everyone else. And again, with a lot of groups, if you have different people in that group running games, for the most part, I think a lot of people would have the same sort of rule set within the same group. It's like this rule set works for most of us. I may tweak 1 or 2 things, but it's not something where I'm going to drastically change a lot of the rules, which is what was happening between those 3 different groups. And the consistency just wasn't really there either. So I wasn't playing with each of the groups, with the exception of the one main one, enough to really get a sense of, when I'm at this place, these are the rules, right? It's just, so again, it was more of a personal thing that I sort of let slide in there. One other issue is when I talked about players or people who were into first edition AD&D not really being interested in second edition AD&D. That again was based on my personal experiences. So where I live in Nova Scotia, 100% of the people that I know who were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition, none of them converted to second, and it is a kind of a smaller number of individuals that we discussed that with, but of that group, none of them were interested in second edition. They all kept their first edition AD&D stuff, or they were playing like the basic expert rules, and that's, you know, they stuck with what they first sort of got into. And the idea of jumping on the bandwagon of another whole new edition just didn't really sit well with them. And you know, the truth of the matter is that first edition AD&D and second edition AD&D are fairly similar with a fair number of things, to the point where I could see how they would simply state that, you know, it's not, you know, different enough, or it's not improved enough for us, and we have the system that we like. So again, I kind of let that slip as, I think, more of a blanket statement that it failed to convert first edition AD&D consumers. And I don't think that's necessarily, again, a fair statement, because I was basing it off of, you know, my group of friends and the people that I know. And in that group, it was 100% had no interest. But again, you know, I don't think that was necessarily the way that it worked everywhere. And I feel bad that I sort of presented it in that manner. So I kind of want to apologize for, you know, letting those personal experiences sort of work their way into, you know, the review or the video, and not clearly defining it enough as these are my experiences and this is why I'm saying these things. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of light. But you know, not the entire time that I had with second edition was, you know, necessarily bad. But it was a system that I was ready to kind of discard when third edition came out, and solved a lot of the inherent issues that I thought that I had with second edition AD&D, like the inconsistencies with when to roll high or when to roll low. And it's one of those things that's really not necessarily that big of a deal. When you're making attack rolls or saving throws, you want to roll high, and if you're making skill checks or ability checks, you usually want to roll below the number. So it wasn't necessarily that bad, but it was just things that people were constantly asking. And I'm the kind of person that if I'm 100% sure of something, but somebody asks me if that's really the way that it is, then it plants enough of a doubt that I'd have to look it up. One of the worst ones is, you know, did you lock the door? And I hate that one because I know I locked the door. It's a habit. I've lived in apartment buildings for, you know, a fair chunk of my life. It's second nature for me when I leave, if there's not going to be anyone else home, to lock the door. But when someone asks me if I locked the door, then it's like, crap, did I? So it's just one of those things that it's sort of my personality. So, you know, I think I made a bigger deal out of the inconsistencies of wanting to roll high or low in the video, when that's probably more of a personal quirk than an overall issue with the game itself. So some of my fun experiences with second edition, because there were a few. It kind of came down to when I was sort of running games and some of the things that I had done. And I guess before I talk about some of the fun things I did, I should probably talk about some of the stupid things that I did, or some of the ways that I just didn't really know how to run the game at that point in time. I remember there was one encounter where it was like giant skeletons that I had the party going up against, and they had like this thing where they had this like fireball in their rib cage or in their stomach cavity of the skeleton. They can pull them out and they could throw the fireballs. In the adventure, in the room, I had decided that I wanted there to be some illusory giant skeletons and some real ones, and that they would randomly switch places. And it was one of those things where I thought it was kind of a cool idea that you would have like the illusion ones just sort of swap places with the real ones, and have like the players figure out that they have to attack the real ones. And anyway, it was something that I thought was an interesting idea at the time, but this was pretty early on, so I didn't have it really written down. This was just sort of stuff I was running off the top of my head, and I didn't do a very good job of explaining the situation. Like, if I were doing it now, I would actually say that the two skeletons sort of blink out just momentarily, and all of a sudden your weapon just passes through, the one that you were attacking, and sort of do that at least so they realize that something had happened. But instead, or just let them roll damage and just say, well, your weapon just seems to pass harmlessly right through it. But back then, what I did was just say, oh, don't bother rolling damage. And it was really, really bad. It was really, really bad the way that I ran that encounter. And to anyone who was actually, if anyone who's in that encounter is watching and remembers, I am sorry, but there was actually a reason for you not rolling damage at certain points. And what would also happen is that fresh ones would actually teleport in and slowly replace the illusionary ones, but I just never got to really explain that very well. So that was a really bad experience, but that was all on me. Another thing was that back then I didn't really know how to run campaigns, and we all start somewhere, right? So I would have ideas, and I would just instantly want to use these ideas, and I didn't really have a lot of thought as to how I was going to implement them or what the payoff was going to be. So I had them enter one dungeon, and the dungeon had this teleport room. And what the teleport room did was it actually took them to another part of the dungeon that was built in an area where time worked very differently. And for each hour I think that they spent in that dungeon, a year passed back in the world that they were from. And so I tracked the amount of time, and they ended up, because it was a large dungeon and because they would rest and stuff like that, it ended up being like 100 years or 200 years, or it was a long time that had passed. And I had mentioned that things looked different, like the buildings were sort of different. Cities or smaller towns that they were familiar with had suddenly gotten much larger, and some of them had become full-on cities, and individuals that they knew were no longer around, and maybe even some of their families had died out. And I thought it would be this really cool thing where it's like, you emerge from this dungeon and it's 100 years later. And that again was an interesting idea that I had, but I didn't have a payoff for it. So I didn't know what to do with it. It's just like, this was an idea that I had, and I thought it would be cool, and it's like, well, I'll fill in the blanks later. And I just never did. So it was, again, I think another issue that I had with 2nd edition is that some of my worst adventures or dungeons or campaigns were in that rule set. So I think, part of me was sort of embarrassed by some of these really bad decisions or really bad ideas that I had, or good ideas that I had, but I just didn't know what to do with, so they may as well have been bad ideas. But again, it really it really unfairly shaped my opinion of 2nd edition. And so, it's actually, when I look back on it, it's a pretty decent rule set. And, THAC0 was a pretty good substitution for the combat matrices that you had, or matrices that you had, in 1st edition AD&D. So in 1st edition, it was all in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And, if your DM was generous, you would have a sheet that had the armor class chart broken down from like -10 to +10, and each number that you would need to roll or exceed in order to hit that armor class. And, that was a okay system, because at that point you could actually look at the thing and say, well, I hit, armor class, -1 or, or less. And, again, that was fine, but not all 1st edition AD&D character sheets that I found actually had that. So, THAC0 was a pretty good substitute, but it does make it easier if the Dungeon Master gives you the armor class, and some DMs really wanted to protect the armor class of their creatures, of their monsters or NPCs. And, really it's just a matter of like, well, if he's wearing plate armor and he's carrying a shield, then he's probably got an armor class of 0. And if he's got +1 armor and +1 shield, then he's probably got an armor class of -2. Based on our levels, and it's just like, just give us that he has an armor class of like -3 with, just something like that. But anyway, THAC0 was actually a good system, and it's not as complicated as I made it out to be, I think, in the video. The biggest thing is that you have to sort of wrap your head around the idea that anything that is a positive or a bonus to your attack roll will reduce your THAC0, or your weapon THAC0. And anything that is a penalty would increase it. Now, you could also just simply have the plus apply to the roll or the minus apply to the roll and treat it. So if I got +2, for example, for some sort of circumstance, and I rolled a 14, I could simply just treat it as a 16 for the purposes of, you know, determining what armor class I hit or what THAC0 I had for the weapon. But I always found it was easier to adjust the overall THAC0 and then subtract the armor class from there. So that was, again, sort of one thing that I may have made it more difficult for myself than I needed to, but I would have, like, my character sheet that I designed had spots for your individual weapons, and your individual weapons, there was a spot for weapon THAC0, which would be adjusted by magical bonuses, which would be adjusted by your hit probability, and anything else like that that would apply. But it was a good change. I think overall it was actually a good change and a good system. As long as the DM... As long as either the Dungeon Master is willing to explain how it works in thorough detail so that the player understands fully, or is just willing to give the armor class so you know that you subtract the armor class from weapon THAC0, and if you hit that number or higher on a d20 roll, then you hit with the attack. So yeah, as far as some fun events that happened with my 2nd edition AD&D games, and some of the fond memories that I do have, again, there weren't necessarily a lot, but there were a few. One of the biggest ones that I remember was I was running this dungeon where the whole point was for the Paladin to get his Holy Avenger. And so the Holy Avenger was, and I read this in one of the books, so I completely stole the idea. But again, this was one of my very first campaigns, so it's not like I knew what I was doing. But he had a vision where he saw a skeleton with this sword kind of thrust between its rib cage, between the bones of its rib cage. And so the player, you know, also was able to discern where the dungeon was that had this. And I loved designing dungeons back then. This was also the same dungeon that had the illusion teleporting skeletons that I did a horrible job with. But I remember the skeleton was actually that of a vampire, and the Holy Avenger was taking the place of a stake that had impaled its heart. The thing is that this was a pretty powerful vampire, so as soon as that Holy Avenger was removed, he would immediately just regenerate back to full. And it would be like the boss fight for the dungeon. Like, this would be the biggest monster in that dungeon. And I thought I would be clever and foreshadow it a few rooms before by saying that they find the stone sarcophagus, very ornately, you know, designed, but the players, because I had used undead very liberally throughout this dungeon, the players, you know, pretty much knew what a coffin meant or what a sarcophagus meant, and so they had found a decanter of endless water. Earlier in the dungeon. It was a random treasure that I rolled. And so what they did is they filled this sarcophagus up with the water, and the priest, the cleric in the party, blessed it and basically turned it into holy water. Did everything that you had to do to create holy water, and so it was now holy water filling the sarcophagus. So they find, and I think I've told the story before, but I do remember it was a really fun kind of adventure. So they found this Holy Avenger, they pulled the sword out, and, you know, to the shock and surprise of no one, the skeleton reanimated, and its flesh sort of knitted itself back, and it turned into this vampire. The player, it was close, but, you know, a couple players, I think, got knocked unconscious, but were stabilized, but they were able to defeat the vampire, who then turned into gaseous form and retreated to a sarcophagus, which was full of holy water. So the player characters followed the vampire, followed this, you know, gaseous form, and I guess I should say that they filled it. But they had put enough in that it was going to cause quite a bit of damage. So what they did is, you know, they followed this gaseous form. It found its way to a sarcophagus. They slammed the lid on the sarcophagus, and they either dogpiled onto the lid, or one of the characters, I think the wizard may have had stone shape as a spell, or shape stone. So they sealed it off, or they did something so that the vampire couldn't get out. It was not like, this was 1999, so this was 19 years ago. So my memories are a little fuzzy on what happened. But they ended up actually killing the vampire, and this was going to be a reoccurring villain that I was hoping to use, but they actually just completely killed it by trapping it in this sarcophagus filled with holy water, and it just dissolved its body away. But that was a fun story. I really remember that, and I really enjoyed that. Another character that I can never forget is Thurbin, and this was a friend of mine's character. So Thurbin was a dwarf, and he was played by a player who I could generously describe as sort of a munchkin. He was one of those players that really liked to abuse the rules and make ridiculous characters, and but at the same time, he wasn't the kind of player that would actively want to destroy the game. He wasn't trying to disrupt the story or anything. He just had these really broken characters. So he used the Skills and Power book, Player's Option Skills and Power, and built his character around grappling and wrestling and punching. And he knew those rules, which is fine because I couldn't wrap my head around them. But you know, he was the kind of person, he wouldn't lie about the rules. He would abuse the crap out of them, but he wouldn't be dishonest. So if he said that this is the way that it was, then I was inclined to believe that. And I remember he wanted to have this. I created, either he wanted it or I created it, but it was this cursed throwing axe called the Dwarf Thrower. And what it was is, and if anyone other than a dwarf used this weapon, it was a regular throwing axe, and you could throw it and it would return. And so that was the way that it worked. It was like a +1 throwing, returning axe. If a dwarf used it, however, there's something in the item's history where it just strongly despised dwarves. So what would happen is you would go to throw it, and what would happen is the axe would just drop to the ground, and the dwarf would be thrown instead of the axe, so it would launch the dwarf. And it would cause damage to the dwarf, obviously, if he impacted something based on the amount of feet that he had flown. So it's not like it was something where there was no drawback to it. It was actually meant to do some damage to him, and it was a cursed item for a dwarf. So if a dwarf used it, it's now like the only weapon he would be able to draw. And I remember it just so many times he would just launch himself as this dwarven missile into combat at the range of his axe, and just start like grappling things and punching them and putting them in submissions, and it was a lot of fun. It was a cheesy, broken character that was probably pretty awful overall in terms of what he could do. But it was a lot of fun, and I just remember that that Dwarf Thrower. That's something I should actually try to bring back maybe into a campaign at some point. So those are some of like the fond memories that I have. I really wish I had more. I enjoyed playing 2nd edition, and I enjoyed running 2nd edition, but it just, I don't know, there was just something that sort of was going on at that point in time. And again, it was only about a year from when I started playing 2nd edition that 3rd edition came out, and I think a lot of us kind of wanted to make the jump almost immediately. I do remember I did hold on and continued to run a 2nd edition game for probably about another 6 months. I think it was into the winter of 2000. So it was for about 4 or 5 months that I continued to run my 2nd edition game, but it just reached the point where I wanted to, just start running 3rd edition. I was, I had all the books, the rule books, the core rule books anyway, and it was what our group was slowly sort of gravitating towards. Anyway, but I think that there were a lot of situations where I remember there were some frustrating experiences that I had with 2nd edition as well, just in terms of adventures that made me, again, I think, kind of sour on it. One of the biggest ones was how easy, because I actually played a lot of wizards back in those early days. I started with a human fighter, but I found that I wanted to play a magic user. And so I did. I ended up making this mage, and I really enjoyed the character. The group ended up moving towards an evil campaign, I think, at that point, which was another one of those evil campaigns where we weren't really evil. But So I remember that, like, I wanted to sort of embrace this sort of evil, character or whatever. And so he was a manipulator of, like, the worst sort. And I remember actually there was a situation where he wanted to introduce a new player by having us rescue him or find him as a captive. And I remember that I was the one that found him. And it's like, he was asking to be freed. And I said that I would free him on the grounds that he served me. And, he ended up doing that. So he was one of those characters that sort of had this, like, strict code of honor. So the fact that he agreed to serve me for freeing him and for saving his life, he basically was at my whim. And I was not necessarily the nicest person to him. Like, I would have him charge into combat, even if it was a bad idea, simply so that I could, maintain a safe distance, kind of thing. If somebody was coming after me, I would make him, attack that individual. And anyway, so there were other things that I had done. Like, if we weren't sure if a door was trapped or if a treasure chest was trapped and nobody wanted to check it, or the rogue didn't do very well, or we didn't have a rogue, I would just simply, get everyone to stand back, and I would order him to open the door and set off the trap. And but again, we were evil, and that's the kind of thing that my character would have done. And honestly, if the other character would have rebelled, there was not much I could really do about it. But the biggest thing I remember with that mage was, so this was in, like late 1999, or even mid 1999. It was shortly after I started playing in the first place. I really wanted to make I guess you could say a cape for myself, or a robe for myself, that looked like the sort of like the Batwing ring attire that the Undertaker would wear for some of his entrances when he was with the Ministry of Darkness. And it was this really cool looking. It was like a leather cape, and it had like these sort of Batwing things on their shoulder. And it was, again, a really, really awesome look. I loved the way that looked, and I wanted to have something for that. And the Dungeon Master didn't want to do it because it's like, well, if you're wearing any sort of leather, it could count as armor, and then you won't be able to cast spells. And it's like, it's not protective, it's like purely decorative. And I remember it was this huge argument just to get this thing that really served no purpose other than to look cool and to look evil and intimidating, and which is what my character wanted. And it was this huge kerfuffle. But we finally got it. I finally got, and he finally says, well, it won't offer any protection. It's like, I don't want it to. I just want it to look cool. But we went into this dungeon, and I think he modeled it after Undermountain, because he had, I think, the Undermountain sets. And there was this room where we had to activate a statue to teleport us to a deeper point in the dungeon. So what happened was there was a statue, and it had his hands out. And I had to basically lock my hands into the hands of the statue and then just cast a spell. It could be any spell. It didn't matter what kind of spell it was. It just had to be a spell. So then, as the statue grasped the spellcaster's hands, these other enemies enter the room. And it was really irritating because I was trapped. I couldn't do anything. I was completely and totally useless the entire encounter. All I could do was try to cast my spell and get us teleported. But the Dungeon Master had quicker going characters, or faster moving characters, just constantly hit my character with, like, so if there was another wizard I was trying to cast, I think it had to be like a second level spell or higher. I don't think it could have been something as simple as like a magic missile. But he had an enemy spellcaster that was casting magic missile, and he had a faster casting time than me, and he always seemed to go right before I did. So he would cast magic missile, and he would split the bolts up, but one would always hit me. And in that version of the game, if you were trying to cast a spell and you take any damage, your spell was disrupted. You didn't lose the spell slot, but you lost the spell for that round. So he did this enough that it actually knocked me unconscious. And I was bleeding out and dying from just the amount of these cheap little quick things that he was just constantly throwing at me. Which really, the other characters were the more major threat. at this point in time, and when the teleportation activated, it would have teleported everyone in the room anyway. So there was no reason to keep disrupting me the way that he was, other than to, you know, have a magic user out of the fight, which is fine, I guess, but at the same time, it was a really cheap way of doing it. You know, if he was gonna try to take me out of the fight, I would have rather he, you know, launched a full assault on me where I was helpless and incapacitate me early on into the encounter, rather than every round just hitting me for like a D4 damage and just nickel and diming me until I was unconscious, because I just could never seem to get my spell off before this other spellcaster or anyone else whoever went directly before me would always do something to cause me even the smallest amount of damage, so that I lost the spell for that round. So that was kind of a painful experience with that. The other thing that we did later on in the campaign was we had found this like magical staff that I was using, and I used it very, very sparingly. I can't. It let me cast some spells. I can't remember what the spells were now, but I think I only used it like once or twice. And we got into this situation where we were overrun by orcs. This, you know, massive orc army was attacking, and we were still evil, but I think we were trying to make a name for ourselves. Again, we were an evil party that did good things. So there reached a point where I just kind of went with it. But I remember that I decided that, you know, I was done playing the wizard anyway. I wanted to make a new character. So what I did was, I knew that there were staffs in the game where if you broke them, it would release all the charges all at once. So that, you know, it'd be this huge, you know, devastating retributive strike, I think is what they called it. So it's like, you know, we're overwhelmed. The numbers are just too much for us. We need to escape, but they're going to chase us down. So my plan was, I turned invisible. I released the player that I had subjugated. I released him from his service. I cast invisibility on myself, and my plan was to just sort of stand in the middle of where these, you know, these enemies were going to sort of charge in, and let them surround me, and then I was going to break the staff and unleash all the charges. And like I said, I had used it pretty sparingly. I don't recall spamming it or abusing it or using it very much. So I was expecting there to be, you know, at least, half a dozen, at least a dozen or more charges left in this thing. So I get surrounded by these enemies, and this heroic act of sacrifice, I go to snap the staff. And I was expecting there to be this huge bang, and I was, like I said, I told the DM, I'm fully prepared to just completely be dead as a result, and not even worry about how much damage I take, being at ground zero. But I want to deal a bunch of damage to everybody around me. So I snap the staff, and he says it just goes pop, because there's only one charge left in the frickin' thing, which I find to be, again, a little bit questionable and suspect, because again, I rarely used it, and we were high enough level that if he gave us a staff that lets me cast magical spells and only had like 4 or 5 uses of it, was a little bit cheap. Now I know that you roll them randomly and whatnot, but someone else had gotten a wand in that same dungeon, or even another staff, I can't remember right now, and he used it a heck of a lot more than I did. So anyway, so it failed. It didn't do anything. Another character in the party was playing an archer, and he was just shooting random flaming arrows into wherever he could, just into this random fray. So he ends up miraculously hitting me with this flaming arrow. Against all odds, it's like I'm invisible, he's firing at maximum range, and he's firing blind. And there's one of me and probably about 30 or 40 like orcs that he could have hit. And he hit me with this arrow. Knocked me unconscious, and then all the other orcs just trampled my character to death. And it's like, it's quite the way to go out, but it felt really kind of cheap and cheesy. And again, I just had so many of those kinds of like minor experiences that just kept adding up and adding up and adding up, that it really kind of soured second edition for me in my mind. And it wasn't fair. It really wasn't fair the way that I look back on it. But it was like, my very first experience was having to audition to play second edition. which unintentionally rhymed. But I really did. Like, he's like, well, we'll make you a character and we'll run you through a combat, and if you do well, you can join the group. And looking back at it, that was a really horrible way to try to get like someone into the hobby that's expressing an interest. I would never do that, because at that point you're also relying on random dice rolling. So it's like, if I just end up rolling low and the DM rolls high and kills me before I get to deal any damage to whatever I was fighting, how is that fair to me? You know, how does that, that means nothing in terms of, well, you're not worth playing D&D, or you're not worthy. It's like, it was, freaking dice rolling. And I didn't realize it at the time, but again, when I was starting to look back at 2nd edition, especially when I was getting ready to record this video, I just remember how angry I was that the Dungeon Master would do that to a young player, a new player, who wants to legitimately get into the hobby. And I think I carried a little bit of that bitterness into that video. So anyway, this was, again, sort of a free-form video. I didn't really have anything thoroughly planned out that I wanted to talk about, but I honestly want to give 2nd edition another chance. And the turning point for me was actually doing the Goblin test. And the amount of fun that I had creating Tar Markvar, if you remember him, he was the character that I rolled really horrible stats for. And initially I discarded them, but I decided, you know what? Part of the charm of AD&D was making the best of characters that just didn't have great ability scores. And nothing solidified that more than the Tar Markvar experience. And just, making that character, running through those fights with the goblins, I actually had a lot of fun. And reading the player's handbook and, going through that stuff again, really, again, sort of turned my thoughts around on 2nd edition. So I think it is a really good version of the game. It's just, there was a lot of unfortunate circumstances that, the edition suffered from, including the collapse of the company that created it. But, I don't think that 2nd edition was really solely to blame for that. And I don't even think it fairly deserves a large amount of the blame. I think there was a lot of other stuff that was going on at the time. Not Wizards of the Coast. TSR was not managing their funds well. They were sending... they were dedicating, large amounts of money to, like, the D&D, or the Dungeons and Dragons Entertainment Incorporated, or something like that. It was the company that produced the D&D cartoon was that, but they were sinking all kinds of money into, trying to make movies, and none of them came to fruition. Like, none of them actually saw the light of day. And I don't even think the Dungeons and Dragons movie, because by the time that was even conceived, that was Wizards of the Coast. So they were sinking all kinds of money into that. They were throwing money at, like, corporate vehicles, and they were just mismanaging everything. And 2nd edition just honestly wasn't going to be able to save them from that. There was just too much the mismanagement that was going on at the time. Did 2nd edition spread itself too thin with all the campaign settings that they released? It's possible, but just recent experience alone has sort of taught me that there's a lot of people that look back fondly on a lot of these campaign settings that TSR was putting out. Like Spelljammer, which is sort of a silly concept when you think about it, with, like spaceship, or, these, basically like what we think of as, sailing ships in space, and, you got hippo people with guns, and but it's like there's just something so charming about it, and a lot of people really loved that setting. I never got to play it, but a lot of people really loved it, and that there's got to be something to that, and I'm just thinking about it. Even something like Birthright, which I think was a ambitious idea, and I don't think it went over too well at the time, but it's really gotten a cult following, where you play these lords, and you're actually rulers of nations, and you're at war, stuff like that. It's just, again, it ends up being a pretty cool idea once it's all kind of out there, and then again, a lot of people really remember it fondly. So my initial bitterness towards 2nd edition AD&D was solely personal, and probably largely undeserved of the rule set itself. And I'm hoping that this video will sort of explain how I kind of got to that point, and some of the experiences that I had with that rule set. And again, I've really changed how I feel about 2nd edition, and I'm looking forward to running a game in it. I don't know how much of a campaign it will be. It might be just a couple of loosely connected one-shots. But I'm looking forward to running it again at some point in the very near future. So, second edition AD&D does not deserve the hate that I gave it in that initial video. I don't think hate's the right word, but it doesn't deserve the way that I presented it. You know, it didn't deserve the blanket statements that I had given it, trying to pass along again those personal experiences as just the overall way that the game was, and that was unfair of me, and I shouldn't have done that. And hopefully this again corrected that. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and for all those people who had sort of tried to defend second edition, I agree with you. I certainly didn't deserve the way that I presented it. So thank you guys again very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you stuck with it because it was kind of a longer one. But thanks again, and we will see you next time. Take care.